Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Friday, April 24th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, as financial pressure builds on the Postal Service, some of its most important responsibilities may be getting harder to carry out. Plus, the Defense Cybercrime Center is making better sense of its data to help fight back against a growing number of cyber threats. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. Defense Department employees have become the latest group to lose their protections provided under collective bargaining agreements as the Trump administration continues to strip workers of their union rights at agencies with national security missions. But unions say they have represented federal workers for decades, have successfully challenged similar efforts in the past, and will continue to fight the move. For more, Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis spoke with Ira Rushing from the Tully Rinke law firm.
With this particular situation and the lawsuits and what they're trying to do, it starts from some pretty explicit statutory authority that President Trump has and that every president's had for a long time. And it's this 5 U.S.C. 7103. And that statute allows the president to essentially exclude any agency or subdivision from the federal labor relations statute if its primary function involves intelligence, counterintelligence, investigative, or national security work, and when collective bargaining can't be applied consistent with kind of national security requirements, right? So this exemption was written into the Civil Service Reform Act. I think it's like 1978, but it's the Civil Service Reform Act, and it's never been repealed. And so the president is the one that we all elect to make national security judgments. And because of that, the idea is that courts owe substantial deference to those judgments, right? So from reading the litigation in California and in the Ninth Circuit, it seems like the administration's general position is that the modern threats, the modern foreign and domestic threats that we see have kind of expanded what counts as national security work. And there's some legitimate arguments to be made there. You know, the battlefield landscape is changing. And so that forces us to be responsive in a fast moving way. And for good reasons, a lot of the time our government's not set up to respond quickly to things that are happening. So the DoD obviously falls under that, but also the agencies that secure the border, enforce federal law, which we see with like ICE and DHS and things, protect infrastructure, regulate dangerous substances, so like the drug, the DEA, things like that, disaster response, so FEMA, and run cyber and intelligence, stuff like that, NSA. So all these agencies kind of fall under what the administration thinks is now national security work. And so the position that they're having against a union is that a union has the ability to kind of slow walk these critical decisions through grievance procedures, and they can force arbitration, and they can tie up management in bargaining over changes. Realistically, that's operationally incompatible with national security responsiveness, right? Like some of these things require decisions made quickly. And if you don't make them in a way that is conducive to the feelings a lot of times of employees, then collective bargaining slows that down. That's the historic fight that we've had against unions. And what the administration is pointing at is that the president has used this before and it wasn't an issue, right? Like, so President Carter, he excluded parts of the NSA. Reagan famously, and that was the big thing, is Reagan excluded the Marine Corps Marksmanship Unit, right, from all of these things, which was wild. And then Bush 43 excluded like certain parts of the Justice Department. So the legal mechanism's not new. What's new is the scope. And so the administration's response is essentially saying what the scope is a policy judgment committed to the executive branch. And Congress gave us that judgment because it wrote it in statute. And that's the administration's position. And the union has, smartly come back and said, okay, well, we have a couple arguments of our own. And their main argument is ultra vires, right? So they're saying that this statute is a narrow carve out. It's not a blank check, right? Congress wrote it for agencies with intelligence and national security work as their primary function. And so bringing in all of these other agencies and subdivisions whose primary functions are like regulatory or scientific, right? Like think the EPA or the FDA or the CDC, things like that. That stretches the statute past its breaking point. And so the unions are saying, look, the president can't use this narrow exception to swallow the whole rule that Congress established for the rest of the federal workforce, right? There has to be a line, there has to be a limit. And then the major federal government's employees union, their big argument is First Amendment retaliation. And that's what the court recently kind of struck down.
You mentioned the American Federation of Government Employees. They are the largest federal employee union representing DoD workers. I think the number is 300,000. But we're talking about 9/11. We're talking the war in Iraq, Afghanistan. We're talking the workforce working through presidents from both parties. So the question is, what's changed? You mentioned it's been applied narrowly. However, this is extremely widespread right now. So what's really changed now? What's underneath this?
It's a good question. I think that's the question that separates what's happened in the legal fight from kind of the political reality. And the legal fight is all about the statutory text. And the political reality is, why is this administration doing anything that it's doing to push laws this far when prior administrations didn't? And there's a couple. The administration's stated rationale in the Ninth Circuit which was accepted by the Ninth Circuit, was that this recent executive order has a legitimate grounding in national security concerns, and that union activity and collective bargaining has an impact on, I guess, the sound operation of agencies and subdivisions with national security related missions. Basically, stripped of all the legalese, the administration's saying the CBA slows agencies down, and the realities of the modern battlefield and national security concerns are just operating at such a quicker pace than they ever have before. I mean, at exponentially, like every year that goes by, things are changing quicker than they did the prior year. I mean, the battlefield now wasn't even conceivable when Bush 43 was president. And so what the administration is saying is we're not stripping these CBA agreements or the collective bargaining agreements because we hate federal workers. They're saying it's hard for us to respond as quickly as we need to very abrupt and acute national security concerns with these CBAs in place because it just slows us down so much. And I think that's a very logical and rational thought. I think kind of the more candid policy answer is that I think something the administration and its allies probably articulate pretty openly is that, realistically, the president wants to manage the federal workforce more aggressively. He wants to hire faster. He wants to fire faster, reassign faster, change duty stations, right? It's, the boomer generations across all industries that are like, telework is bad. If I can't see you physically in the office, then I just assume that you're incompetent and lazy. And they want to end telework, reduce headcount. That's a big Republican policy narrative is big government bad. And so removing the CBA doesn't just remove the union, it removes this procedural friction that the union enforces. That's kind of the big difference.
You talked about the workforce and kind of everything that they will lose and the protections they will still have. But in terms of the immediate impact, could you talk about what this actually means for the workers today? What changes for them right away?
Nothing really today, because nothing's really going into effect today. But I would say, the most immediate change is going to be procedural, not substantive. So like, yesterday, a DoD employee with a workplace problem went to the union representative. Today, that pathway is just closing a little bit. I think what's going to happen immediately is that negotiated grievances, they'll stop being filed and accepted. I think we talked earlier, I think existing grievances in the pipeline will either get held in abeyance or dismissed, or maybe just kind of die a quiet death, depending on the agency and what stage it's in. Or maybe arbitration hearings get canceled or postponed indefinitely. I think that's where the litigation piece is going to come in, but that's not going to happen today.
That's Tully Rinke's Ira Rushing speaking with Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, as financial pressure builds on the Postal Service, some of its most important responsibilities may be getting harder to carry out. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Tune in Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. for the Innovation in Government Show, sponsored by Carasoft. Hear from the industry leaders advancing the technologies shaping how agencies modernize secure operations and deliver better services. Innovation in Government covers what is changing now, what is working from cybersecurity and cloud to data, AI, and emerging technologies. Listen to Innovation in Government, Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. on Federal News Network. Search Innovation in Government.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. USPS leaders have warned Congress about financial strain, rising costs, and the possibility of service reductions, concerns that all show up first in rural delivery. That stress now collides with growing demands on the mail system, including election-related responsibilities. Congresswoman Nikki Budzinski, representing Illinois' 13th Congressional District, joins me with her thoughts on the challenges facing the Postal Service. Congresswoman Budzinski, it's so great to have you back on the show.
Great to be back with you.
I want to talk about the recent Postmaster General's testimony. He told Congress that the Postal Service is under real financial strain, talking openly about higher postage and even service reduction as options. You've been an outspoken advocate of Postal Service. Tell us what you're seeing, especially in the rural areas that you represent.
Well, what I would say is the importance of universal service. And I think that's a really important distinction. I think there's a real tension between, is the USPS to operate as a business or is it there to provide a universal service? I very much, in my Postal Service caucus that we've established in the House of Representatives, believes in the foundation of a good United States Postal Service is that it does provide universal service. What I mean by that is no matter where you live in this country, whether it's an urban, suburban, or rural community, you can have reliable, on-time, first-class mail be delivered to your home. And I represent one of those districts that has a lot of rural components and communities in it. And I can tell you that seniors in rural communities are relying on on-time mail delivery to deliver their prescription drugs. I still have a lot of constituents that have their paychecks that arrive by mail. So I think what was really a unique opportunity to have Postmaster General Steiner come before the Oversight Committee. I was excited to get the chance. We call it waving on. I don't typically serve on that committee, but because of my special interest in the Postal Service, I did, to just ask him questions about, he's immediately jumping to, we need to raise the prices on postage. I would actually argue, I think we need to take a step back before we increase costs immediately to postage. We know in 2022, the last time there was true, really large, comprehensive postal reform, through that reform process, there was about $60 billion worth of savings that was found through that reform process that really helped on the financial solvency questions as it relates to the USPS and maintaining that universal service. I think we should be looking at creative ways for us to look at reforms. How can we save money before we pass increased cost on to consumers who, I could tell you, in a district like mine where we've seen challenges with more on-time mail delivery rates, it's really a hard sell, I think, to folks to say, I'm not getting my mail on time and now you want me to pay more. I think we should be working together to try to find reforms. What I mean by that is, how are we helping to improve our on-time mail delivery rate so we can increase volume? Increasing volume is going to help with the solvency of the financial situation of the USPS. And then lastly, Terry, I'll just mention too, I think a reform we should be looking at is giving more flexibilities around pension investments and things like that I think have been very rigid and have tied the hands of the United States Postal Service to take some outside of the box, kind of look at the flexibility of their investments to maybe save some money and then not immediately raise costs.
We have certainly, for recent memory, treated postage as the way that the USPS raises its operating funds. If we don't raise the money here and there aren't enough cost savings from internal operations, would you be thinking of an alternative financing mechanism for them?
Well, I think that, I don't want to completely take off the table the fact that we might get to a place where we've looked at all the reforms, and maybe we do need to consider making the case as to why a postage increase is necessary for the solvency of the USPS. So it's not that we should completely rule that out, but I think we should look at every other option first. And so I do agree, kind of what you're suggesting is, more flexibility that the USPS can have around their investments. One of the things that happened in 2022 with reforms was the way they looked at the healthcare financial obligations for postal employees, whether that needed to really be front-loaded or if that's something that could be kind of more spread out, helping to relieve some of the financial burden. I think we should look at things like that. Have we finished that work now around those types of flexibilities? Again, increasing volume. I have a lot of, as you know, concerns around the Delivering for America plan, and that because of that plan, I think we're seeing in response to that lower on-time mail delivery rates because of the consolidations of those distribution centers and the way the RTO plan, the way the mail is going out. If we could figure out how to fix and improve our on-time mail delivery rate, that too increases volume and gives us a better footing to make the case for the USPS to consumers.
I'm speaking with Congresswoman Nikki Budzinski. She represents Illinois' 13th Congressional District. Well, Congresswoman, let's take that reality that you've just described, challenges with on-time delivery, challenges with volume, challenges with cost, and overlay that with elections. Mail-in voting has been in the news quite a bit lately. Putting politics aside for a minute, where does the Postal Service need additional resources in order to handle the ballots while it's already under this kind of financial pressure?
Well, we need to be supporting the workforce. I mean, one thing I didn't highlight at the top of our piece is just the shortage of staff that we have. And I would also say the burnout from the postal, whether it be a mail handler or a letter carrier. They've been on the front lines since well before COVID. They themselves are seeing one of the bigger pieces of federal legislation is how are we providing protections in the workforce for them? They're seeing an increased amount of assault. So I think supporting the workforce is one thing that is really critical to ensuring that we're getting our ballots out and ballots are being returned. We have a healthy USPS that's supporting that. I'm very disturbed by, and trying to put the politics aside, but to just call this out, the executive order by President Trump was certainly very alarming. What his executive order would do is actually empower the Department of Homeland Security to almost come up with a curated list of citizens that are eligible for mail-in ballots. And, in a state like Illinois, we have permanent vote by mail where you can actually opt in to always receive your ballot in your mailbox and have it returned. That's created a lot of great flexibility for people that are working to ensure that they have their rights to vote. Then you look at other states in the West like Washington State, Oregon, that have moved to 100% vote by mail. So with the president's executive order, my concerns around it obviously is one, nationalizing elections, using mail-in ballots as a rationale for why he needs to nationalize elections. States have the specific authority to do that, and they've created and well-utilized vote-by-mail programs. So I do think that executive order is a direct assault on the ability to vote by mail. There's been a very controversial federal legislative piece, the SAVE Act, that he's been trying to muscle through Congress. I think if he sees that as something that's not going to work, this executive order might be the other thing that he's trying to impose on people to scratch his itch. But it's very deeply concerning. And I've led a letter. I'm working with some of my other colleagues to speak out against that and what it means for vote by mail.
What does it mean for the postal workers who would have to sort who could get a ballot based on that list? We just talked about how short they are in people and funding. Yeah. Could they even execute that mission?
I think that's a very good question. I think it's creating more bureaucracy. And so we don't have a workforce that can necessarily respond to that additional bureaucracy. The other pressure that I didn't mention is some of the controversy that happened at the end of last year around the postmark. So we are trying to actually encourage constituents in my district that utilize vote by mail that if you come up to a Friday and you still have your ballot in hand before a Tuesday election, we're really telling folks you got to drop it off at a drop box or go into an early vote site, because really no longer can you just bank on that postmark being postmarked before that Tuesday election. And so that also is another thing that is changing the dynamics of vote by mail.
As Congress weighs postal reform, pricing, and governance questions, what's the red line for you? What must be protected to make sure that USPS can handle both everyday delivery and high-stakes responsibilities like elections?
It's my belief in universal service. Universal service is critical to, I think, the way we look at and believe of the United States Postal Service as a public service for all communities, not just communities where it can make a profit, but for our rural communities that otherwise our private sector partners in mail delivery would not have the financial ability to deliver mail regularly to our rural communities. So what I would say my bright line is protecting that universal service obligation that the USPS has to all constituents and communities across this country.
I've been speaking with Congresswoman Nikki Budzinski, who represents Illinois' 13th Congressional District. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, 2 administrative moves are getting the attention of federal employees and retirees. But first, the Defense Cybercrime Center is making better sense of its data to help fight back against a growing number of cyber threats. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The Defense Cybercrime Center is implementing a data mesh fabric to create more structure around its data. DC3 believes that by improving how it tags and labels data, it will be able to make better and faster decisions to protect Defense Department networks and systems. For more on how this data fabric works, Federal News Network's executive editor Jason Miller talked with Kajal Paul, the Defense Cybercrime Center's division chief for architecture management of data and enterprise.
This is going to be a key player in decision making in the minimum cyber side of it. I can think about it. If you break this data into 2 parts, one part is that internal data and the other part is the business data. When we talk about the internal data, we're talking about the lot of time we collect data, network data, to make a decision within our network, which is related to your source, SIM, and XDR, those kind of products. So basically, not only those data has to be tagged properly and send it to the centralized data location, sometimes we call data lake, and then you have the AI modeling and utilize those and make a decision. And a lot of time, if you think about this is, I'm talking about the network data. Behavioral side of the data give you the option that either insider threat or external threat coming, or someone is impersonate some person. So behavioral kind of things, I think the AI is playing good role. And this is now question is, how fast make decision. If someone you're coming into the environment and break in, you have to immediately make a decision. If you wait for 1 or 2 days or 1 hour, you lost. They can delete all the data. What you have seen in the striker case. So this is, I'm talking about the internal network piece. So we do apply those decisions and apply those data points and make instant decisions and use the automatic response. How we do this, we generate a automated generated policy through the system, and most of the cases automatically. Policy enforcement, we apply on it. And some cases man in the loop. Some cases why man in the loop, is critical. Do we make this decision how much your risk tolerance is? Sometimes you are blocking some of the site, it may stop your mission. So we need to make a decision. That's where the man in the loop come into the play, even within the AI world. Let's move into the next part, the business data. I'm just going into this. That gets more complicated because the network within our control, but the business is not, a lot of times is not our control. DCT owns some data, but our Air Force, Army, Navy, and all other components, they have their own data, but we cannot work in a silos. So we have to collaborate with all the agencies. And how we do this, that's where the data fabric data mesh talking about. When you deploy the data fabric in a DC3, this data fabric also have a collaboration or interchange within the agency in that appropriate class or impact level. So if we are able to communicate, then we'll be able to fetch the data whenever we need it and making a decision. So then federated data fabric, what I call, or federated data mesh, if you can constantly dynamically modify and update and stay on top of it, any federal agency should be able to develop their product on top of the data lake using the data fabric we are creating it. I think this will be the ultimate solution if you go and look into the future. And not only this, any AI model can tap into this and can build their decision and making in a right point and right time. Is that answer your question?
When you said the business side was more complicated, it sure is. So I'm going to ask you maybe to go a little deeper on that. The data you're getting from the services, your partners in collaboration, is that cyber data, or is it like financial management data that may have a problem in it, like an attack by an adversary or a backdoor, or are you talking just cyber, one-to-one cyber sharing of data?
Is above all. So nowadays in the world, you cannot just isolate your cyber versus the business financial versus ransom and some kind of the type of work we do. So we can't isolate. We have to collect all the data, and that's where the proper data tagging and data classification play a big role. That's what I'm keep on focusing on, that your data fabric. How we define data fabric is what classification level are those? How are we going to store? How are we going to act? Those access control has to be properly implemented within the data fabric. So if someone can tap into this, the data fabric, they want to bring out the data in a different classification level, they will not be able to. So that's where the access control make a place. But it's the answer to your question, the data you look in the holistic nature, all of the above. It is not sampling. When you're sampling the data, the AI cannot make a decision, or fine-tuning model is not going to work properly in the future.
And the problem with looking at all the data is there's always so much data. It never ends, which is to your point of kind of having to bring in the tools like AI and others, machine learning, to help give you all a better understanding. When you go back to the internal data now for a second, you talked about general policies, automatic responses, keeping the human in the loop when it comes to understanding risk tolerances. Has that gotten harder, easier? Where are you with that process? How often are you able to apply these automation tools to your data when it comes to cybersecurity?
That's a little easier compared to the business data, our mission commission data, but still complicated, because nowadays, if you look at the there's not a single tool. There are many tools are installed in our environment, protected different purposes. And collecting those data and packets and the logs and properly tag them into that data fabric and data lakes, and it gets complicated. Now, as you said earlier, rightly you said, too much data also creates too much problem. So if you can, the best option is for us that optimizing, fine-tuning the model, what you're looking for, what kind of event you're looking for. There's a lot of false positive and false negative. How you want to isolate those things? Those are the key. And it is not one-time job. It's a continuous improvement, continuous monitoring. So basically, continuous of fine-tuning this tool and become a key process, the way we look into this data.
Kajal Paul is the Defense Cybercrime Center's Division Chief for Architecture Management of Data and Enterprise. He's speaking there with Federal News Network's Executive Editor, Jason Miller. You can find their full conversation at federalnewsnetwork.com. Search Ask the CIO. Coming up next, 2 administrative moves are getting the attention of federal employees and retirees. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. OPM's request for more granular FEHB health data and the Postal Service's suspension of employer pension contributions raise separate issues, but they share common questions about privacy, authority, and long-term trust in benefit structures. John Hatton joins us with NARF's perspective. John, it's great to have you on the show this morning. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
We've got a couple of things to talk about. The first is a new request from OPM for medical claims data. They're looking for detailed medical and pharmacy claims data from FEHB and Postal Service health insurers. What is this all about?
This was a recent notice, came in December. They were requesting comments. It got a little bit more attention in the last couple of months. And this is something OPM has requested before, as far back as 2010 under the Obama administration. It had some pushback from the insurers, the plan carriers at the time. It has pushback this time as well. They were closer to developing a system of de-identified claims data sharing, a few years back, but it still hasn't got there. So OPM, I believe, or the generous way of understanding this action is as an oversight agency looking to analyze this claims data to help drive policies that are going to improve health outcomes or reduce costs. But their notice was very short on details. It didn't explain why they needed the data, how they were going to use it, if they were asking for personally identified data or personally de-identified data, how they were going to receive that data if it was in a de-identified form, how they're going to secure the data so it is not stolen by a nefarious actor. We've seen data breaches in the past with OPM. And I think OPM itself is, yes, it's an oversight agency of these health insurance programs. And I think like CMS, has an interest in potentially having some claims data in the right form. But it's also part of the federal government and is therefore the employer of millions of federal employees. And what we see in the private sector is HIPAA tries to protect employers from having data on their employees. And I think it's very understandable that federal employees wouldn't want their employer having access to this. Are they going to, you always have to think about the worst case scenarios of data. Could you retaliate for employees? Do you want to, fire employees that cost more to cover because your health insurance costs are higher for them? And so you really do want that firewall in place so that the employer cannot use the data in the wrong way. And I'm not saying there's any plans to do that or that's the result behind this, but I think you always want to have those protections in place so you have security about your health and the privacy of that data.
Do you see a signal here about how OPM might be trying to manage the health benefits program differently going forward?
I think it's hard to say, but, they always come up with a call letter that asks for changes in policy coverage of certain things, what they might incentivize insurers to do in terms of how they're covering procedures or medications does one type of thing have a better outcome than another? Seeing longitudinal data from, if you even have de-identified data, but you can track how it impacts, how one person's healthcare impacts them over time and how some of these things work. So I think there's legitimate interests that they could potentially use, but there's also some nefarious or bad things that could be done with the data. So I think it's about really making sure it's done in the right way if they want to do it. And I think their notice was very, very low on details, very low on the types of explanation of what they want to do positively and how they're going to prevent the negative impacts.
Is there anything that folks who are currently enrolled in FEHB need to do differently at this point to protect their data?
No, I mean, their data is going to be with their health insurance carriers. So right now, there's the same potential security risk, but they have, health insurance carriers that are trying to protect their data as best as possible, knowing that there's always cybersecurity risks. But, making it known to your members of Congress that this is a concern for you and that this should be done the right way, I think is one thing you could do.
I'm speaking with John Hatton. He's staff vice president of the National Association of Active and Retired Federal Employees. John, let's switch to another group of federal employees, postal workers. The U.S. Postal Service has announced it will temporarily suspend its employer contributions to the FERS pension fund. And they made that announcement a couple of weeks ago based on testimony to Congress. So what's going on here?
Well, USPS has another cash crunch. We can get into why that may be, but they've decided, in our view, prematurely to suspend these contributions. The law requires them to make these employer contributions into the fund. They're still taking money out of employees' paychecks and sending it into the fund. So they, in our view, they should send their employer contributions as well. It's not a near-term risk that anybody's not going to get paid, but this is the funding mechanism that ensures that there is budget authority and funding to provide these benefits down the road for both federal and postal retirees. So you stop putting money in, eventually at some point in the future, there's not going to be money there to go out. And in our mind, it's a really bad precedent to set to do this. And it's really Congress's role to change the law, not the Postal Service's role to decide not to follow it.
When the Postmaster General testified before Congress, he heard back from some members that there were going to be no more bailouts for the Postal Service. So what does that mean for folks who are currently affected by this delay in payments? Might those payments never catch up?
Well, if there's no resolution in the Postal Service's financial situation and they never start to repay back this money, there is going to be an unfunded liability in the fund. I don't think that's going to get there. I think, what does a bailout mean is really up to interpretation. I think what we see with the Postal Service is that the value, it's designed to, it's directed to provide a universal service mandate, 6 days of delivery each day a week to pretty much every address in the country. That's costly. Now, it's supposed to be able to pay for that through ratepayers and with a monopoly on service for first-class mail. The value of that monopoly has greatly reduced. So the cost of the universal service obligation are greater than the value of the monopoly. And so that kind of design of how this works out to be able to provide that without any taxpayer additional assistance makes it more difficult. So, that monopoly may be reducing because you have internet, you have declines in first-class mail, you have private sector competitors. And so it has been dealing with this trend and this financial kind of difficulty in terms of the cost of benefits not balancing out for some time. Now, are there short-term solutions to this that don't really address that main problem, but that give them some breathing room and get at, just improve their short-term financial situation? Yes, and I think Congress is looking at those as they did in the hearing. So one thing they could do is extend or increase the borrowing limit that the Postal Service has. It's not been increased since 1990, so most private sector companies would be able to go out and borrow more to finance their operations rather than have some artificial legal limit. Can they look at investing some of these funds in their retirement plans somewhat differently, or at least to start in the Postal Service Health Benefits Funds to reduce their obligations for past liabilities? The Postal Service wants to have some congressional decision that they're paying too much for old CSRS liabilities that are related to their obligations when it used to be the Postal Department. And there's these amortization payments for that. Now, that's really a decision of who pays the Postal Service, ratepayers or taxpayers. In our view, as long as it's being paid into the fund, we don't really care if the Postal Service is paying those amortization payments or if the Treasury is, but that's a decision for Congress to make as well. So there's things they can do in the near term to resolve the situation, but I think there's a longer term issue regarding that balance between the value of the monopoly and the cost of the universal service obligation.
And is this affecting pension payments to those who are already retired?
No, it's not. The Civil Service Retirement Disability Trust Fund covers all federal and postal retirees and their survivors, and it has more than $1 trillion in the fund. To the extent there's unfunded liabilities in the CSRS portion of it, because agencies didn't pay the full kind of dynamic normal cost, that's paid through amortization payments from Treasury. The FERS system is designed to be financed to that dynamic normal cost. That just means accounting for things like cost of living adjustments and raises over careers and things like that. So every year there's a different contribution level set that's designed to make sure that's fully funded. So as long as everybody's paying in that specific dynamic normal cost, will be fine. Now, if the Postal Service decides to stop doing that, then we start to have an issue. But again, that's a long way off when the fund has more than $1 trillion.
I've been speaking with John Hatton. He's Staff Vice President of the National Association of Active and Retired Federal Employees. John, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Hear the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. A pay raise for federal employees in 2027 is looking even further out of reach. The House Appropriations Committee has advanced spending legislation that makes no mention of a federal pay raise next year. That aligns with the White House's omission of a civilian pay raise in its budget request from earlier this month. Here with the latest is Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for joining me.
Nice to be with you, Terry.
Does this really mean that there's no possibility for a federal pay raise next year?
Nothing is impossible, and we're not going to see all of this ironed out officially until most likely December. But the House Appropriations Committee's bill for financial services and general government for fiscal 2027, after that passed this week along party lines, or at least advanced out of the committee, that lowers the chances that federal employees are going to see a pay raise starting in January. That comes after, as you said, the White House's budget proposal from early April, where they included a 5 to 7% pay raise for military members, but made no mention whatsoever of civilian federal employees. So that disparity there is plus now with the House Republicans' bill siding with that as well and not issuing some sort of alternative to the budget proposal. All that essentially means that federal employees are still on this track to see a 0% raise next year.
As you said, though, the bill has just come out of committee. So what are the possibilities that something different could happen?
There's still possibilities for House lawmakers to decide something different before they pass the final budget or the final spending bill for this section of the government's budget. There's also a possibility for Senate lawmakers to determine something different on their side. And then there's also the possibility of President Trump by August issuing an alternative pay plan that may say something different than the 0%. If we look to last year, for example, and how this process worked, there was similar steps in the early process where we didn't see a pay raise included in the White House budget request. But then later in August, President Trump did include a 1% pay raise for most civilian federal employees. So there's all these possibilities. There's also the FAIR Act in the House, which is a bill from Democrats that would give federal employees a 4.1% pay raise. So there are some options on the table, but the chances are still, I would say, low for us to see something different. Most likely it would be from, I would say, President Trump's alternative pay plan if we were going to see something different. But again, it's not really clear whether or how likely that really is.
So we want to leave a little morsel of hope out there, but also be realistic about this.
Exactly. I think that's a good way to put it. There's not it's not an impossibility at this point, and we're not going to see anything become truly official, as I mentioned, until December, when President Trump would sign an executive order with whatever pay raise he's planning for January and on in 2027. So until we see that executive order, there are a couple options still on the table.
From a bigger perspective, what else is included in this spending bill?
This spending bill is one of 12. The Financial Services and General Government bill covers agencies like the Treasury Department, Office of Personnel Management, General Services Administration, Small Business Administration, and a couple other smaller agencies. In total, for this particular spending bill, there's House lawmakers are looking at a discretionary budget of $25.3 billion for fiscal 2027. Just to put that in perspective, it's a 3.8% decrease from the current enacted spending levels, or in numbers, $1 billion less than what those agencies combined have right now for their discretionary spending. So if you break it down a little bit further, Treasury is going to see one of the bigger cuts from this bill. They would get $12 billion in funding, which is about $1 billion less than their current enacted funding. It's still not as steep of a cut as the Trump administration wants. They proposed in their budget request $1.5 billion versus $1 billion in cuts for Treasury for 2027. There's also a smaller budget for OPM. GSA's federal buildings fund, though, would get a slight boost. So there's a little bit of mix in the numbers here, but across the board, there is going to be at least somewhat of a cut under this House proposal.
Does that proposal say anything about OPM's budget and spending priorities?
So the budget that they're, if you just look at the top line spending that they're going for in 2027, it would include $418 million for OPM. It's a relatively small budget because it is a small agency, but that's actually higher than what the White House included in its budget request. They're looking for $375 million for OPM. So House is saying maybe a little bit higher than what the White House is wanting. But if you look into some of the provisions and the details of the spending legislation here, committee lawmakers are also encouraging OPM to continue some of their ongoing initiatives towards modernizing HR systems. That's a project that OPM has talked about pretty extensively, where they're trying to take all these disparate HR systems that different agencies use and consolidate them and modernize them, put everything onto a single platform. That might be still a few years out from now in terms of those efforts, but it's something where we are seeing now House lawmakers say, yes, like OPM continue working towards that goal. They're also encouraging OPM to continue their federal hiring reforms, plans to connect with industry and the private sector for outreach and recruitment. So there's a lot in there where they're trying to just express that they're encouraging OPM to continue on the track that it has been for at least the last year or so.
Well, that's good to hear that progress can continue. Were there any other policy riders of note that might affect federal employees in this bill?
There were a couple small ones that would affect federal employees. One would prohibit agencies from using funding for training or implementation of any diversity, equity, inclusion, or accessibility initiatives. That's something we've heard the Trump administration talk about pretty extensively. So not entirely a surprise that Republicans are including that in their spending bill here as well. Another provision that's included in the bill would just require agencies to use official time in, quote, an honest effort to perform official duties. Official time, which is something that has been a bit of a contentious topic between Republicans and Democrats. So just seeing that is of note, perhaps, to federal employees and the unions who represent them. And then finally, there's one new provision that would essentially codify a current prohibition on the coverage of gender-affirming care through the Federal Employees Health Benefits, or FEHB program. Right now, OPM has barred FEHB carriers from covering gender affirming care. That's for, gender transition surgery or things that support transgender employees. And if this bill is passed as is, it would essentially put that prohibition into law. So a couple, tweaks here and there, but bottom line is they're looking for, some changes at least.
That's Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, we always appreciate your close read of this legislation.
Thanks for having me, Terry.
You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. As AI continues to deliver real impacts across government, what can you learn from agencies at the forefront? Join Federal News Network's AI and Data Exchange next week, Tuesday, April 29th and Wednesday, April 30th at 1 p.m. Eastern, to hear how agencies are scaling AI effectively and securely. Register today at federalnewsnetwork.com. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.